It's going to spawn. So if you bring your chair in, is that plugged in?
Which one? No. Does it need to be plugged in?
Well, if the battery goes in the middle, yes.
Okay. Sorry. Just give me a couple of minutes, Dr. Sawa. I'm just trying to organize myself. Just let me put my computer on in case. Yeah, let me turn on the...
Watch that glass. It's on the other side now. Watch the glass. Watch the glass now.
All right. Okay. I think I'm almost there. All right. So you can go ahead.
So welcome everyone, and today is our first unit, that is evolution of migration, and we have with us Dr. Raj Bardoli. Let me introduce her briefly because by now you know her because she has come twice or thrice and gave talk in our webinars. Dr. Raj Bardoli did PhD in economics, and she has extensive teaching and research experience in many countries, African countries, the Caribbean, Canada, and now she is in USA and Dominica. She has also worked in several top UN organizations such as UNDP, UN, and many other international organizations. And she is right now an independent consultant to many organizations and based in Dominica and Washington DC. And her research interest you all know now. She has been working on migration issues, diaspora issues, and so many other areas, mainly development aspect. And we'll be very happy. She'll be taking around 1 hour, and after that you can ask question and interact. Feel free to interact and ask as many as questions possible. And with this brief introduction, over to you, Dr. Raj.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Sada. And I have to apologize for this technical glitch. Anyway, I think I'm sorted out, but in between you may find that I will need some help. Okay, I'm not very good with technology. All right. Today's lecture is the evolution of international migration. And that means we will go to the history of international migration. Not so much in historical data, where possible, yes, but actually to see how the history of migration informs us of the situation in contemporary migration or migration situation. In other words, what can we learn from the history of migration? How does that inform us in our contemporary situation? The kind of issues and challenges that one is facing in the present day. And maybe some of the challenges had their origin in the previous migration flows. So the lecture will be as follows. I'm sorry, I do not have PowerPoint presentation, but what I will do is at the end of the lecture, maybe in the next day or so, I might send some notes. But for the time being, the lecture is organized as follows. I will give an overview of a historical perspective with the view to situating the contemporary migration debate. I will also discuss the different forms of migratory labor, such as pioneer settlers, slave labor, indentured labor, permanent immigrants, contract labor, and the volume of such migrants over time. The direction and determinants of migration, in other words, what are the drivers of migration, the political economy behind the evolution of migration policy, and I will briefly discuss the Zelensky's model of the migration transition and its prediction for future migration. I think it will be helpful for us to have some idea as to how what Zelensky predicted might not come true, might inform us of the future migration prospects. And then, of course, some reflections on the future of migration itself, taking into account the ongoing COVID pandemic. Okay, so that sounds mouthful. but I'll try to go slowly. And please interject if I'm going too fast or if I'm going not making sense, okay? So do interject, and it's always good to get some kind of feedback and interaction. All right, so the history of migration, international migration. Here we are only focused on international migration and not on internal migration. If we look at the pre-modern history, we know that human migration has been going on, is as old as humanity itself. And what does that mean? When we say human migration is as old as humanity itself, that means people have been moving from their place of origin. In this case, the place of origin for the humanity was Africa. So from Africa, some people have moved to Eurasia, to Asia, to Europe, and then later on to Americas and to the Pacific. So these were the areas which were uninhabited. So what the migration did was to inhabit the regions of the world. So by moving around, they were inhabiting people, or people were going around and inhabiting the regions which we know now, Africa, Asia, Europe, the Pacific, and so on and so forth. Now, early humans, they migrated due to changing climatic conditions and in search of food and for safety and security, very much what people are doing in the contemporary situation. So people moved, or human beings moved to other places where they could find secure food and food security, and where they could have safe environment, away from wars or away from environmental challenges. So then started the age of exploration. Okay, so the age of exploration, that means some people were exploring and looking around what they could find. So that was not migration in the sense that they were moving to permanently. They were still exploring to find places that would really be great for them. Okay, so there have been quite a few invasions, as you know, the empires, including the European colonialism. Even before that, Roman and the Turkic empires that have been moving around and colonizing people. People have been moving, so there have been quite a bit of movements. What I will focus on for us to understand the contemporary migration is actually to start off with migration in since the 16th century in the United States. The reason I want to focus, and I will mention other regions too where there has been some migration, but not to the extent that it happens in the Americas, that it actually helped to shape the making of these countries, or the making of the region. So even though there was migration before, the pace of migration was slow, and it was not in large volumes. But this accelerated since the 16th century with the discovery of America. As you know, in the 15th century, 1492, Columbus discovered America. Excuse me. But then people were not moving. Around the 16th century, you find that some pioneers who had money, aristocrats or nobles from England, who moved to America to set up colonies there. The first colony was set up in, I'll quickly go fast, so we can come to the point. So the first colony, English colony, was set up in America in 1607 in Jamestown, which is Virginia, which is the place of tobacco. As you know, this Virginia tobacco, famous. So with that came the need to have more people to work on the plantations for the cash crop. So although the English who migrated in very small numbers. These were pioneers in the 16th century and followed on. They did hire local labor, the Native Americans, but that wasn't enough. The labor was not enough. So that necessitated to get more people. So the news got around and more people migrated from England initially. And by the 16th century, there were some 24,000 Europeans who arrived in various cities in America and set up colonies. And in the process, they also decimated the local population. So the period that quickly I want to say a few words is the period of 1492 to 1820. So migration from Europe started in significant numbers, moved from pioneer migrants to more people coming in. And this period also is marked by slave labor, because the labor they had was not enough, and they were looking around where to source cheap labor, largely because the demand for sugar on the plantations and other plantations was increasing. And as the trade set in, they needed to produce fast, and they needed to produce a lot, and they needed to produce fast. And as a result of increased production and trade, there was continued demand for labor, cheap labor, who could provide work on the plantations. So in this time, the dominant form of labor was cheap labor through coercion. Through coercion, that means slaves from Africa were brought in, were imported. Roughly about 12 million slaves were brought in from Africa. And they were then sent, they were not only working on American plantations, but they were also sent to some of the colonies, British colonies in the Caribbean. And so in this period, we see that the most dominant form of migration was coercion, slaves. And at the same time, there were also some white indentured labor from England who came voluntarily. They were not forced to come, but their conditions were pretty bad. Not as bad as those of the slave labor, but pretty bad. And as a result, there was quite a bit of protest, political pressure to remove this form of white indentured workers or system for that matter. After serving for a few years, they could work freely wherever they wanted. Now, the thing with the indentured, even white indentured labor, was that they were so poor. Some of them were convicts or prisoners who had come to pay off their loans to the crown. And after they had worked for a few years, 7 years, and paid off their loans, they were free to go wherever they wanted to go. So this is a period where the form of migration was coercion and contract, white indentured labor. Then is the period, which is an interesting period, and which is the period of mass migration. And that is 1820 to 1913, just the onset of World War I. And this period is marked by a surge in migration from Europe to the United States, notably England, followed by Ireland, Germany, Scandinavian countries, and later on Austria, Hungary, Russia, and Southern and Eastern European countries. That's much later. So around this time, roughly 55, and by the way, when we say the New World, that is not just the US only, that includes the Americas. That means the United States, Canada, South America, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, these are the places which were not inhabited except by natives before. So there were natives there, but before that, after that, there was a lot of land and resources in these regions because they were very sparsely populated. So this period also marks the end of slavery around 1820s legally, although in Brazil, it took a little longer. So what happened now? With the end of the slave labor, which was cheap labor, brought the revival of the indentured labor. As I mentioned, there was white indentured labor in the earlier on period. So with the end of slavery, labor was needed, and now the capitalist system, remember one thing, and there's a question also that inherent in the capitalist economy is the need for cheap, continuous cheap labor. So hence they were looking for, this was now, they were looking for cheap labor after the end of slavery. Then they looked for cheap labor as indentured or contract labor, not this time from Europe, but from Asia, China, and India. Remember, these were the labor abundant regions or countries in the world, India and China. So some 50 million indentured labor from India and China, approximately 29 million from India and about 20 million from China were brought in to these regions under the dominions. Even in South America, Chinese went to Peru to work on the mines. East Asia and the Pacific Islands, Indians went to work on sugar plantations in Fiji. They went to the Caribbean, or West Indies as it was known in those days, to Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad. They even were shipped to French islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and other islands in the Caribbean, and to Mauritius, of course, to Mauritius. Now, that's quite a bit of large number of these. So the high demand of labor now was also fueled by processing industries. So it was not just to work on plantations in this period, it was also to work on processing industries because of the agrarian and industrial revolution. So there were three forms of industries now, capitalist activities now. One was the plantation economies combined with agricultural and industrial revolution. And then there is the mechanized mining. And thirdly, the railroad construction. Now, this is the period where railways and road construction transport was constructed. And actually, I forgot to mention that one of the, I will come to the drivers of migration in this period. So then there was construction across America, Canada, and then labor was needed in the gold mines in California, and with this gold rush, and Chinese went in, were hired on contract basis to work in these gold mines. And then later on, under the British Dominion, Transvaal, which is in South Africa, Transvaal gold mines, Chinese were contracted to work there as well. And later on to Australia because of their experience in gold mining or in the mining industry. Okay, so the features of migration in this period was that the European migration was considered permanent. That means they were there permanently, although some of them returned either to set up families or to set up businesses, but mostly settled there. While contract labor was for a fixed period of time, although some stayed on. Now remember, this contract labor was for a particular reason, either to work on the mines or plantations. And those who were in the British colonies in the Caribbean or in the West Indies, most of them stayed on after the end of their contract, as they did in Natal, but not Transvaal. Chinese labor was terminated in Transvaal. I mean, they were good workers, industrious workers, but they didn't want them anymore. And in this period also, there was pressure from home countries like India on this indentured labor, sending countries because of the bad conditions that the contract labor met. So, and if you recall, Mr. Gandhi from India, he was a freedom fighter. he went to work in South Africa, and he actually did quite a bit of work on human rights for indentured labor, and with pressure from the Indian government, and as well as pressure from the population, the Indian indentured labor stopped in 1916. So they were there for almost 100 years, 1850s to 1960. Okay, so this is the period. So what was around this period, as I mentioned, 50 to 60 million approximately Europeans migrated to the Americas. And what were the consequences of such massive migration out of Europe? Now, remember, this migration was unfettered. That means there was open door. There was no policy. In other words, it was free, open. Anybody could come in who had the means to come in, or anybody who had of course, there was the desire to go to other places because of poverty and to better their economic conditions. But also, if they were able to take such arduous, long distance trips on very underdeveloped means of transportation. So around this period, there was the introduction of the steam ships. Before that was the sail ships, which took much longer. For example, in the case of labor from China to Peru, it took almost 5 months to get to Peru, similarly to the Caribbean islands. But by then there was the steamships, which took a little shorter period, but nonetheless, not like air transport. So we find that in Europe, migration or emigration or out of Europe migration began with in-migration within Europe. Now, the beginning of any emigration or out of a country is preceded by immigration within, from rural to urban or within regions. It is not straight away emigration. So this is the history. And those of you who are familiar with the demographic transition, that as a country moves from pre-modern to modern stages of development, that means stages of development where there is less reliance on traditional means of agriculture and other activities. So the population is much higher in the pre-modern times, because the mortality rate later on in the early industrial time, the mortality rate is controlled, but the fertility rate takes a little longer. And as a result, there is net increase in population, and the population continues to grow. And if the economy is not growing, then the increased population or the surplus population has to find a way, which they do initially in moving from rural to urban areas. And we are all very much familiar with that. So the European emigration began with migrating to different European countries which had better economic prospects, okay? So what's the other consequence? So you see that there were hostile invasion of native lands by settlers as well as by immigrants, the English, the early settlers. So they took land, and there was virtual annihilation or marginalization of the native population. The pioneers played two roles. One, of course, they were the first to find the place and to settle in the place. And secondly, they became, in a way, a magnet for attracting more people, because there was already some diaspora. So that's the role of, so it becomes a pull factor. So it resulted in the expansion of existing and new immigrant societies in America. So you may have heard of Little America, Little Italy, Little China, and so on, these colonies. So politically, people some people in Germany, those who moved from Germany, they did that on account of not only poverty, but also to run away from religious persecution. So they had the freedom to pursue their religion when they came to America, and they could follow any religion of their choice. And some people left their countries, European countries, from oppressive monarchical regimes into more egalitarian and liberal settings. Culturally, it set the stage for long-term westernization, okay? And of course, in this stage, also there was the abolition of slavery and the disappearance of the redemption system is the white indentured labor. So the pace of migration in this period by 1913, because of the onset of the First World War and the depression of the 1930s, the interwar years between the First and the Second World War did not attract too many people because the economy had slowed down. Now, the basis of migration to Europe was actually not only the availability of labor, but also the pull factor. That means there were economic opportunities in the US because of or in the New World because of vast land and other resources, which was a pull factor and not so much the push factor in terms of population and poverty. So in this period, after the end of First World War and the beginning of the Depression era, the US introduced certain migration policies now. Now they realized that it was too many people coming in and it was upsetting the political landscape, cultural as well as cultural, political, religious landscape. Of course, the immigrants had contributed tremendously to the economic growth and innovations in the United States. So in 1917 in the US, they set up an act or a law which required immigrants to have some kind of literacy level. I mean, before that, most of the migration from Europe, most of the migrants from Europe were basically peasants. They didn't have much education, although later on they did have some artisans or some craftspeople who came to the Americas. But initially, and for most part of that period, it was basically peasantry or people who were farmers with little human resource endowment. So that was in 1917. In 1921, they set up a quota system. That means before that, people could come in as many numbers as they could afford to come in. But in 21, they set up a quota system to regulate the flow of future migrants. Now that was based on their size, each of the nationalities like British, Dutch, Germans, and so on. So according to the size, the number of their population resident in the US in 1890, only 3% of that population of that nationality could come into the US in that way. So they had this quota system. So that quota system restricted the number of people who could come in. And then there was another in 1922, similar. So now, what do we find? The mass migration led to restriction in migration. So one of the questions is, explain how this mass exodus or migration sowed the seed of its own destruction. That means there was unfettered and free movement of people from Europe to the United States. And mind you, there was heavy discrimination against people of color. So it's not that the Asians were welcome, even if they could afford to come to the country. And because of the long distance and not much developed transport system, the Asians were shut out, except for some contract labor on the railways and California, mines in California. So this was aimed, these regulations or acts or immigration policies were aimed to slow down the flow of people into the US. Similarly, other countries in the New World also followed suit. I think New Zealand was 1899, and as was Canada in I don't know if it was 1900 and something. They also had policies which were unfavorable to free flow of people. So the decline in migration due to the slowdown in economic growth and the introduction of migration policies, it led to now the I can't say evolution, but it led to the encouragement of contract labor, because contract labor is easy to control, and you can keep them when you want them, and you can push them out when you don't want them. And remember, unlike with capital labor, that means labor which is in the machinery and so on, if it stays idle during slow economic period, the loss is to the owner of that capital machinery. But in the case of slowdown in the economy, the loss of labor, the loss of labor part of production is for the contract labor, because then they are pushed out. So it's good for the capitalists. So they don't have to pay for them. They get rid of them when they don't need them. Okay, I think I didn't say anything that even though in the earlier period, migration from Europe was largely from Western European countries, and then also North European countries, Scandinavia, Scandinavian countries, and then of course Ireland because of the famine and so on. And then later on in the 1870s, there was migration from Southern European countries. And they largely went to South America, to Argentina and Brazil because of more land there and better opportunities. So what we have so far found that it was the revolution in the large-scale migration from Europe was also facilitated by the transport revolution, okay? Because now it was not the sail ships, but it was the steamboats, which made long distance shorter, a little bit more, but cheaper than the other one. And it led to extensive operation, because now they could go to China, they could go to India, they could go to other places to recruit labor. So the pull effect of demand for labor was the network effect of the pioneers, which reduced the uncertainty and the cost of migration to potential gains from migration. In other words, the diaspora becomes, in a way, a pulling factor, because would-be migrants or future migrants feel less insecure if they take the journey and don't succeed initially for a little while, but they have a place where they could put their head down. Okay, so this is where, so what is in summary, I want to say something to summarize. Let's see the time. It's okay, I still have some time. I want to pull some of the threads, or before that, maybe I could say something on the migration in Asia. I think I did mention. So this is what happened. Around this time, so we say much of the focus has been on the greater Atlantic economy, because that is where the resources were, and that is where people moved, and that is where opportunities continue to exist. People still want to go to OECD countries. They're not going to other countries which may be a little bit more developed, other developing regions. So this time we find that up to the 1920s or 40s, there was migration within Asia also. And Chinese, they went to other regions in Asia, such as Burma. Indians went to Ceylon on the tea plantations. I mean, some of these were under the British Dominion. South America, of course not. South Africa, as I mentioned, Transvaal and Natal, Caribbean and the Pacific I mentioned, including Australia. So roughly 50 million people moved around this period, 1890 to 1940, from their countries of origin to other Asian regions where their labor was needed. In addition to that, history tells us that 50 million more people moved around this time, 1890 to 1920s, 30s, from China to Russia to go to Siberia. Now, Siberia was also a place which was uninhabited because of the climatic conditions, and had vast land and resources. So wherever there was land and resources, people moved. In the case of Europe, in the 30s, soon after World War I, the economies picked up, because that's also the period when they were benefiting from the Industrial Revolution in England, and the economies were growing. And this is a period where they were entering into industrialization era, later industrialization era, where they had almost achieved the demographic transition. That is, even though the mortality rate was low, the fertility rate also declined, and the net addition to the population was not much. And later on, it became negative, and hence the need for labor and so on. Okay, so I think this is good time for me to say something on, unless there is some questions before I move to the next. Is there anything somebody has a burning question to ask, or wants some kind of discussion on some of the issues which may not be making sense? So if there is, kindly, Dr. Rakesh, please do guide me how to spot these people, because I don't see anyone. And I don't know what, are you there? Hello?
Yes,
Wow.
yes.
Oh,
We're here.
sorry. Okay.
You want some questions right now? Shall we open for questions?
Oh, I can wait. I thought if
Now we can have a short break, and we can ask question answer.
Okay. Is it making sense?
Yes, very good. So if there are any question, you can directly ask. I think there are some question already. Like,
okay. But I am not able to check the chat box.
shall I read out?
Please, if there's some questions you feel should be answered now, please go ahead and read them to me.
Actually, one question is there, which is Mr. Dr. Muhammad Hossein Sarkar asked, how do you foresee the migration trend in post-COVID era? So
no, I'll come to that. I'm sorry.
That
I
is
haven't
one.
touched that. No, when I discuss that section, I will take that. Is that okay? Can I take a rain check? Can I do that?
Madam,
I can do that unless he's not, because I haven't covered it yet. And I want to speak.
Okay, I understand. So if there are any question, please raise your hand, since there is nothing in the chat box. So you can raise your hand and ask question.
Yeah, somebody's saying. Okay, so do you have any, can you check for me, please, Dr. Sada, anything in the chat box that it covers what
Chat box.
areas I have covered?
I think they're all listening you. Now they may ask you.
All right. Let me continue then. Shall I continue?
Yes, better. Then meanwhile, they can ask question.
Okay, very good. All right.
Okay.
So what we find in the case, let me say a bit on the Zelensky's migration transition, because there's a question on that as well. This might be a good time to interject, because I'm going to talk about how European countries that were sending people out of their countries are in fact receiving now countries into their country. Receiving migrants into their countries. So the Zelensky's migration transition is basically it draws on the basis of the demographic transition, which is linked to the stages of development. And I think I mentioned briefly before. So stages of phases of development. I won't say stage because that will then bring in the Rostov's economic growth theory and so on. I would say phases of development. So that is pre-modern phase. Pre-modern phase is characterized by agrarian, primitive agrarian production systems where almost everybody is working on the land. Okay. Now, what Zelinsky did in his hypothesis or model of migration transition was to then extend it to the mobility, human mobility or geographic mobility. That phases of development in terms of producing demographic transition also have some link to how these stages or phases affect human mobility. In the pre-modern time, when societies or the means of production are less developed, more people are rooted to the land and they work on the lands. And the mortality rate is high because the technology for medical technology is not developed, as is the fertility. So the net result is almost zero population growth because more people die as more people are born. Okay. And then in the early industrial phase, there is improvement in production methods, there's more growth, and that leads to more production possibilities or activities, and there is the beginning of the rural-urban migration. As people in rural areas find that there could be better prospects in urban areas, they begin to move. Now, this is also the time when, while the mortality rate goes down because of advances in medical technology, fertility rate doesn't. It takes a while because it's a behavior. Fertility is a behavior which takes time to change. It doesn't change overnight. So fertility continued to increase while mortality went down, and the net result was net addition to the population or population growth. With population growth, there was a need to look for better and more or different activities to fend for the needs of the families and the population, and hence migration from rural to urban areas continued. So there was this geographic mobility at the same time. But this is also the period with early industrialization that there was some movement outside the country, as we noticed in the case of Europeans going to the Americas. Okay, that was the early industrialization. So around that period, there is some emigration, but not a huge lot, slow emigration. At the same time, there's a small fraction of in-migration from outside for skills, because this is early industrialization, so they do need, but from where, I don't know. Anyway, in the later industrialization period, population growth slows down as the mortality rate is down already. And the net result is that there is still increase in population, but not to the level that was found in the early industrialization period, but nonetheless. So this is also the period which actually attracted a lot of people leaving the country from Europe into Americas. This is the period, the period 1820s to the early 1900s. So there is this time emigration as well. Now the third phase, which is advanced stage or phase, where there is a lot more activities, economic activities, there's growth. Now, this is the period which is marked by now slow down. This is the period of the 1900s in the Americas that we're talking about, that the emigration slows down because there are greater activities in the countries themselves, okay? So this is the period where there is this transition. That means the movement out of the country is now contained. Okay, few people will always move, but not to the extent of exodus or huge. Now, So the out-migration slows down, and in comes the in-migration or immigration, because this is the period where greater skills are needed, and if they can source those skills, they will try to obtain them. So the transition time is where now your population growth is almost zero, almost negative. More people, but I mean, people, not that the people are dying, it's that the people are not being replaced. The ones who die are not being replaced because of very low population growth. And this is the time the population is aging, so they are not in the reproductive period as well. So the geographic mobility is constrained. So somehow rural to urban migration is very low because there's no need, because the rural areas are not rural anymore. They become more urban than rural, except for those that are still working on the land, people working on the land. So this is the transition period in the advanced stage. Now, Zelinsky also talked about the super advanced stage, where there is the ICT, information and communication technology revolution that we see in our contemporary time, where it is possible to be able to work from home, as we are doing all our meetings online and so on. And that some of these activities can be done at home, and therefore there is not much reason to be mobile. So actually, this is where it levels off. So initially, when the economic growth takes off, there is out migration, right? That's what it leads to, out migration, okay? And then it reaches a peak, and then it begins to, excuse, there's background noise and I can't find my headphones. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Yes, we can hear. We can hear.
Yeah, sorry. So excuse the background noise. So there comes now. So the economic growth reaches a certain peak, and the out migration, once it peaks, it levels off. And after that, there is no significance. Some people will always emigrate for other reasons, for pleasure, for learning, for exchange, and so on, but not for work opportunities, not necessarily. Okay, so that is where what Zelinsky talked about, the transition is out migration, and then it increases with economic growth, and it continues to increase until it reaches a peak, and that it levels off, and that after that peak, in fact, some in-migration or immigration sets in, and that is what he talked about in the modern phase, in the super modern phase, where there's science and technology and communication revolution or development. There will be less mobility because people don't need to go out, and there is also very low mobility within, except not rural to urban, except within regions. So if you are in a city in region A, you might go to another city in region A, but not to region B. And often people settles down for various reasons, which I will not go into, but one of them is that the old people don't move that much, so the geographic mobility is constrained. And secondly, young people, when both spouses begin to work, one is working here, the other is working over there, then they find something which will bring them to a common place instead of commuting from one to the other. It slows down the geographic mobility. And then there comes a time when you have made enough money, you say, I want a peaceful and quiet and environmentally safe conditions of life. I want to move into suburban, remote areas, and with that, and so on and so forth. Okay. So what Zelinsky said about the super modern phase was that, although he said it was hard to predict how migration would hold or not hold for that matter in this phase, but his prediction was that more likely it is the skilled people or people with some skills who would move, who would be needed outside their countries for that matter. In other words, countries that have super ICT, they might need people from outside who could fill the gap that they don't have. So this would have some impact on people who are relatively unskilled or undereducated or have less human resource endowments. So remember what is happening now. Is pivoting towards those who have skills and against those who have less human resource endowments. So you can see how this mass migration set the pace for what ensued in terms of policies, in terms of the forms of migration, and in terms of the type of people who would be able to permanently migrate. Here, migration is moving one residence to another residence for a considerable period of time, not like circular mobility or short-term mobility or contractual mobility for a fixed period of time, but rather permanent. So there is a dent on permanent migration, at least for those with fewer, but those with some saleable or marketable skills will still be able to move around if they so desire. Okay, all right, so far so good. Now, I talked about migration in Asia, which was fueled by commodity boom because there was all this need for commodities which required some labor. So what's the situation now? Very quickly, and I will give you some figures from the IOM 2020 report, which captures previous data as well as the current. And I think up to 2019, from 1970 to 2019, yeah, I didn't say much about from the 1950s to the 70s. I think there has been some movement, but not to the extent that. Now, this is also the period, maybe I could say a few things. Migration from 1950 to the 70s and so on. 50s is the period when many British colonies gained, 50s, 60s, 70s, gained political independence. Notably in Asia, but a little bit earlier in the case of India in the 40s or 47, but in the case of African countries in the 50s and 60s. So soon after, some of these countries had the option to opt for the citizenship of the colonial citizenship of the colonial masters, that is countries, colonizing countries. In the case of Britain, France, Holland, and so on and so forth, some of these European countries. So some people opted for, but there was all kind of catches I will not go into. A lot of West African, Francophone West Africans opted for the French, Senegalese, and Cote d'Ivoire, and so on and so forth. West African countries, which were French, largely French colonies, as well North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Now, so their inclination after independence was to go to the colonizing countries rather than stay, or with all kinds of protests. I'm not going into that, but just to quickly sketch that some people did migrate to their countries of their colonial powers. England, France, Netherlands, people moved to a lesser extent, but mainly England and France. These were the big powers that colonized many countries. Some people who had fought in the World War I, World War II, and on behalf of Britain and so on, got some whatever places got some space there to settle down in England and so on. There was migration from African, Anglophone African countries, Nigeria. Lots of Nigerian, well, not lots, quite a few in the 70s migrated to England because they had the oil wealth and they had the connections and so on and so forth. But smaller African countries, by and large, migration from Africa has been insignificant in relation to other regions in the world. And the African diaspora is small as a result because not many people migrated and therefore not many followed after the initial. I mean, there is some movement, but not to the extent you find in the case of India, China, Mexico, and other countries. Also is the period 70s, also the period, or 80s, 90s. 80s is also the period when the Berlin Wall fell and there was movement of east to the west and then eventually consolidated as one country. And with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was some movement of people from the former Soviet satellite countries into the Soviet, into Russia. Sorry about that, into Russia. So there was some movement over there, and I am not very sure. Maybe there should be a question when there is a situation like political conflict and there is a movement of people from one to the other. I am afraid to call this migration in the traditional sense, but of course. Professor Kadria should entitle us. I'm a bit, just like in 1947, when the British India was divided into two, there was a mass exodus from one part to the other part. Do we call this migration or do we call this, it's not voluntary. Is it voluntary? Anyway, this is a debatable question and we can talk about it. I'm just throwing it into this space, in our discussion space, if somebody wants to pick it up. Sorry? Okay, I will continue, so then we can discuss. Okay, I think I have only 5 minutes.
In case now we can actually activate, in case you want to entertain few questions, first batch, we can call their name, batch wise, so that they can ask. Shall I call their name?
Yeah, just a second. So do I not say anything on the future of migration and COVID?
Yes, that is one, but there are other also. Can I ask them directly to ask you?
No, because I haven't spoken, so I don't know.
No, accept that.
Yeah, okay. Just 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay. So the migration situation now, as it stands in 2019, the latest data that the IOM report tells us is there are about 272 million people who are living outside their country of origin. Okay, we only say their country of origin. I'm not saying birth, we don't know where people were born. Okay, so this hasn't changed as a percentage of the global population, roughly the same. In 1970, there were about 85 million people, and that was 2.5% of the total global population. In 1980, 202 million, 2-point-something percentage of the global population. In 1990, 153 million, 3% of the global population. In 2010, about 221 million, 3.4%. And now 272 million, it's about 3.5% of the global population. So really, as a percentage of the population, it hasn't changed drastically. In numbers, yes. And the higher the number, and we know the benefits. I'm not saying benefits, we know what the migrants bring in, and they bring in a whole lot of, they send out remittances, and there will be a separate lecture on that. And so they will detail on that, who are the major recipient of these. Major sending countries are, of course, India, Mexico, and China. And forgive me for not mentioning Mexicans moving or migrating to the United States, roughly about 11 million currently as the regular, and quite a few other people from South America, Central America, and so on. Okay, so as regards the future of migration, how does the future look like? Well, nobody knows. Looking back at the history, and if we use the Zelensky's hypothesis or his prediction, it would seem that the future migration is, permanent migration. Okay, so when we say migration, I'm saying permanent migration, or people who want to move permanently their homes from where they are into elsewhere, also to safeguard the welfare of their generation and the future and so on. Permanent migration looks a little bit unlikely. Why? We already have these restrictions put in the immigration laws that I alluded to. And in 1990, the US also passed another immigration legislation, which categorizes future migrants into 4 categories. One, which is reunification. People who already have their families there, their immediate families can join, and maybe parents can join as well. So that is reunification. And secondly is the refugee and asylee, people who are seeking asylum, that. And thirdly, there will be employment visas for employment reasons. And then they have this lottery visa, So what one finds looking at these categories of likely immigrants. So the first 2 categories, family reunification and the, what's the other one? Family reunification, as well as people who are coming on refugees. And so they're unlikely to be highly educated. Well, they will be, but they're unlikely to have too much human resource capital, okay? I'm not saying refugees don't have, so forgive me in case there's a question lashing me. Well, Syrian refugees are highly educated. But anyway, the number is likely to be very small, and it depends which sources they come from and which countries get preference. And the visa, people coming on employment visa obviously will be highly educated. And the ones on visa lottery is a way to diversify their population, but I think it's losing ground due to political pressure. So that leaves you with very few who will be skilled, whose skills will be needed in the future. So that's one part. And the same applies to the OECD countries. They're also reducing. They have no room. They have no room, and there is too much, as they say, migration fatigue. There's too much political pressure on them, on the politicians to do something about this. So as regards COVID and the future, the future doesn't look very big, very, very promising. Remember, the migration to America was also fueled by this tremendous growth, economic growth. Right now, we don't see much growth, not in the near future. Maybe it will take at least few years, 5 years or 10 years for the growth to pick up. Right now, the whole world is on a standstill. Not much is moving, not much is happening. So where are these people going to find employment? And with the ICT revolution, the chances are that the geographic mobility will be further constraints. There will be outsourcing of work, which is already done. China is an outsourced country for manufacturing for the United States for many reasons. And you can't bring back those jobs because you won't have people in your own country to do those dirty jobs. One thing I want to say, what is happening, and it's interesting. There is migration of unskilled people, but it is on contractual basis. I was in England a couple of years ago to find Heathrow Airport the cleaning department totally transformed. You find a lot of immigrants who are from all kinds of nationalities. And I spoke with, are you still there, guys? Hello?
Yes,
hello?
all of us are here.
All right, 1 minute and I'll wind up. Okay, I'm sorry. It's as they say, I always say, this is an occupational hazard, talking too much as a professor. Okay, so I talked to some of them and I said, strange. Some years ago, I had this profile of people working like Indians, Pakistani, Bangladeshis. Now it is totally Nepalese, totally different profile. So the supervisor, I spoke with him, said, madam, we bring in people on contractual basis. So I am the one who recruits, they are on contract. And these contracts are for 6 months, they don't bring their families. And after 6 months, they have to go back and I get another lot or the same lot, but anyway. So what is happening is there is movement of unskilled or semi-skilled people. They might be highly educated, I didn't speak with them, but they resort to that in the hope that after putting in 2 years of 6 months, 6 months, 6 months, they might be able to get work visa and bring their families, which is that doesn't happen. It is not happening. because they don't want them permanently. So if this is a scenario where the economic growth is very low, right, and will continue to do so until this pandemic is resolved, and that will take time to now kickstart, and that the forms of migration, that there's a way to then recruit people on a temporary basis and get the work going, then there isn't much hope for permanent. So the permanent migration, I don't see much hope. Canada has 250,000 people who can come every year. And this is on the basis of point system, which Australia started, followed by Canada, followed by the UK. Point system, the more education and the more experience and the more languages, English plus French and other languages you speak, the greater points you score. The younger you are, the greater point you score. And therefore you are the one who's picked for that. So when you're picked for that, you don't get the job you are qualified for. And we all know that very much. Initially, and for a very long time, in the case of Canada, I can speak with confidence, people coming as doctors and engineers through the point system, they get into the country, but they are performing jobs which are done by people who are not educated or skilled because they have to pay their bills. Okay, so even though Canada has opened to taking 250,000, this is to fill in the gap for the labor that their own people will not do. Okay, so to close down, I don't see much future for permanent migration in the near future of 5-10 years and so on. Who knows? Nobody knows the future. But anyway, thank you very much. And I do apologize for over time. Okay, please do guide me. Guide me when to unmute. Guide me when to unmute.
Yes. No, you keep it open now.
I keep my phone, okay.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Raj, for a very exciting, very insightful talk. And now what we'll do, we have also with us, alongside Dr. Raj Bardoli, another stalwart, Professor Vinod Khadria, and then we have Paddy, who will be also joining in case they want. You throw question, we'll get answer from 3 of them. They are expert also, alongside Dr. Raj Bardoli. So we will open now this floor. The first batch, as I mentioned, this will be 5 people, Dr. Tulika Gaur, Samikya Gelot, Ganesh Chauglai, and James Onsuma, and Stones James. So you directly now you can ask questions. We'll open your mic. Okay. Tulika Gaur.
Hello.
I have given the name. We'll come back again to you. Dr. Tulika Gaur, you unmute. Please unmute. Yes.
Hi. Good evening, everybody. My question to you, ma'am, is like in the pre-modern society, when the migration started taking place, was there any social influence or any social factor that was also responsible for it? Because when we see in the pre-modern state, the societies are very less developed, and almost we can say that almost every area was full of resources, land, food, and other availabilities. So why was the need for migration arising in the first place itself? Was there any social influence also playing any role?
Do we take few questions and answer, or do we do one by one? Dr. Sada, can I answer one by one, or shall we take few questions? Hello?
Better to take few questions together.
Okay,
what is convenient to you? What is convenient to you?
Okay, all right. So was there any social pressure or social influence for people to migrate in the pre-modern time? No, what had happened was in the pre-modern time, again, I'm an economist, I'm not a historian, okay? But what I understand, and I'm a labor economist, that means migration is at the heart of it's my passion too. So people migrate generally, even in the pre-modern time, when they were basically moving around, looking for the fact that our ancestors, our not immediate, but our previous, humanity had moved. It wasn't due to pressure. It was due to certain reasons. And the reasons were they wanted better food, more reliable sources of food, and they wanted protection from the environment. They wanted social safety nets in the sense that where they could to flee from wars. Because remember, in the olden times, there were a lot of wars because there was wars over resources, wars over land, right? So they moved, and they moved to places which were not inhabited. So they went to inhabit, to populate, to people the regions. So that is what migration is basically. They were peopling various regions. They kept on walking, they kept on moving because they weren't any means of transport, or maybe mules, perhaps. I don't know if they existed. So I would not see if, but it's a great question, if there was social influence for people to move, pressure to move. And unlike today, these days, there are family pressures to, like in the case of the Philippines, somebody was telling a story that in students, well, young people for that matter, students are not, if they don't have at least one family member outside the Philippines, they have this tremendous pressure. They say, how come you don't have anyone outside? So-and-so from my family, everybody so-and-so from my, so that is more immediate sort of thing of the social pressure, okay? But in the pre-modern time, I wouldn't say it is it's the necessity, it's the need to look around, right? It's like even the people who are herdsmen, people who rear cattle, they just move. Why do they move around? There's no pressure. They move around for the cattle to get more grass, and they find a good place where they settle down, then they move again. So I think I would say in the olden time, pre-modern time, it was more your own survival and that of your immediate family that was the driving force. Okay, next.
Okay, Ganesh, Samiksha, and James.
Hello.
Yes,
Hello.
please carry on.
All right.
Hello.
Yes, carry on, Samiksha.
Okay. Hello to everyone. My question is to ma'am that tracing the roots of evolution, can you highlight the economic terms from which the migration graph has gone so far?
Sorry, say it again.
Am I audible to you now?
Yes.
The voice is muffled. Can you, yeah, say it again, please. What graph?
The migration graph till now, from the history, tracing the roots, can you highlight the economic terms of the migration, how they have grown, and in the economic terms?
In economic terms, how they have grown? No, I don't
Yes, ma'am.
understand.
In fact, this livelihood is very much linked to economics only. She taught same thing.
People moved because of their livelihood. In other words, people have always moved for their survival, for their continuation of their species, continuation of their generations. And the fact, actually, if you search the word migration, it is not only human mobility involves human mobility for survival. In other words, we move for continued survival, for our better opportunities. That is why people move with supposedly, you say anticipated better opportunities. Not that you get them, but you anticipate. It's always in anticipation of something that we take this step of moving. Oh.
Okay.
Is that okay?
You got the answer, Samiksha?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay. So now we'll go to Ganesh, James, and we have 2 James and 1 Ganesh. Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good
I'm
morning.
James. I'm James from Ghana. My question is, how can we involve the leaders in developing countries, especially Africa, for them to create jobs for the youth so that unemployment rate reduce to avoid migrants or people migrating for jobs in the developed countries? Thank you.
Okay, to that, I would say as JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy said, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Okay, so why I throw this point is that we have reached a situation now, especially in developing countries, where most of them have not attained their demographic transition. In other words, there is still population growth. Very high. I don't know about Ghana, it's probably 2% something, 2 point something. Okay, so you have this demographic growth on the one hand, which presents challenges. That means a lot of population and a lot of young population, especially in the case of Africa. In some countries in Africa, I think it's as high as 50% of the population is under the age of 25. So you have a large number of young people who are by and large educated, because in education in many African countries is more or less up to high school free, so sort of free. We'll not invite more discussion on that, because it's free is you don't pay a fee, but you pay for stationery, books, your boarding and lodging and so on. But anyway, okay. So what can the government do? What sort of policies? Well, firstly, we have to see what the labor market looks like. As a labor economist, there were times when we thought, some of us, that perhaps our economy should be planned. That was the time of when Marxism was in its height in some of our countries, including in Africa, socialism and so on, that there should be planned economies so that people know where they can work, what they can do, and so on. But there is a lot of misfit. So colonial education has not been revamped in many countries. They continue to produce people or graduates who are not necessarily akin, who are not necessarily aligned with the needs of the labor market. And you know, it's a very difficult situation. There's large, so the only thing I can say is the role of the government I now see in a free market economy is to facilitate, is not to provide jobs. It is to facilitate creating jobs. And with ICT now, with the information technology, with computers, with all these developments now, on the one hand, what developing countries are facing is they are in a way in the super modern era, where there is science and technology revolution, and yet when it comes to their means of production, they are still in, I'm not saying pre-modern, but they are still in the early industrializing period. So there's a great mismatch. So how do you resolve that mismatch? Either you train your people to meet those kind of demands, right? Or you shut in. It's not possible to now become insular economies and import substitution. Gone are the days. Those were the 50s and 60s, and you know, all those Cardoso and all these, we all talked about this, how countries, and Arthur Lewis and, you know, all these economists, you can close in and replicate what you import. It's not going to be happening, okay? We are open economies now. We are globalized, and in a globalized system now, what can the young people do? They feel so desperate that they just look outward because they don't see much hope inside. Now, the hope can be created inside if government has policies to empower people, to provide credit, provide skills generation outlets, to provide guidance, to provide all kinds of training facilities and so on, but to encourage people to become entrepreneurs, to become innovators, and in a small way it is happening. So somehow young people will need to create jobs for themselves, to become their own providers. And beyond that, I don't have any ready-made solution. I can only say that now is the time now to challenge yourself and become entrepreneurs. What is it that you can do in a small way? You don't have to be big time entrepreneur, because the resources will dictate how far you can go. But your determination as a young person can be pivotal to where you can reach. Okay, sorry, that's the most I can say. It doesn't help young people. I feel for you guys. I really do. I do. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Comrade James.
Yeah. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah. Well, I have a question, but I want to begin my intervention from responding to my namesake, James Asuma, to make the point that migration itself is not a crime, because I am from the trade union and I speak for workers. That migration is historical and is not a crime. But what are we talking about, which is the crisis today, is the management of migration. And that is why our major focus is about advocacy and agitation for regular migration as against irregular migration that is creating crisis and leading to human violation and that of both human and labor rights. So if you have employment in a country, it's not a deterrent to migration. But the question is, what kind of migration? Because there are different kinds of migration. There are professional migration, that my people who migrate for jobs. So what are we talking about is how to make migration management better off, how to ensure that we control irregular migration and promote regular migration that create decency and dignity for human beings. So I want to just add that. But my basic question to the presenter is that, as I have indicated in the chat box, she has made mention of economic growth, transport revolutions as major issues that propel migration in the early stages, especially in Europe and other continents. And she has also said that cheap labor is one of the major drivers of mass migration. My question, therefore, is that as these are major attributes, growing speed of capitalism that is still encouraging irregular migration today, in need for exploitation and cheap labor, are we sure that migration can be better managed to reduce negative consequences? Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you so much for this excellent question. Yes, there will always be need for cheap labor. There will always be need for migration, okay? If regular migration, if there are bottlenecks to regular migration, people will find a way to use irregular means. So I totally agree with you. What is needed is how to manage how to manage migration so that there is regular, safe migration rather than creating crises where lives are being lost, where there's violation of human as well as labor rights, where there is more prejudices erupting from this, where people are not being treated as people. So all this irregular migration, there is a market for irregular migration. Even in the US, how do you think there are all these people from Central America, South America, Central America, Mexico, they want to come into the US because there are agents, there are opportunities, but because the government policies are such which restrain such regular employment opportunities, that the work is being done underground. And this is, I agree with you, that what is needed is how to institute safe, regular migration, whereby not only that the dignity of the worker and the human is maintained, but also that there's some order. Because right now, exploitation is rife. People coming from Mexico or Central American countries, not only are they losing their lives, they are being mistreated so badly that they have no recourse. What is happening in the Gulf countries, right? So I agree with you. Even in the Gulf countries, yes, it's not regular migration in the sense that people are being hired through intermediaries, through agents. where they end up, what they do, what their rights are, all those are being violated. So even if there is sort of contractual labor going into the Gulf region, it is not that their rights are being respected or that they are getting correct wages. They're just used as a, as and when needed and throw them. It's like throwaway labor. So this, I agree with you. I couldn't agree more. Now the question is migration the answer? And I say no. Would there ever be a stop in migration? No. How can we make the migration? In other words, migration is not a strategy. It's not something to be outright, I am against it. If you have skilled people, you cannot control people from moving. Yes, of course. But what you can do is to safeguard that their movement does not jeopardize their lives and their human and labor rights are respected. So here, I think the government has to play an important role. And as I mentioned in my presentation, that in the case of the indentured labor, both in China and India, there was pressure, political pressure from the populace, from the population that, hey, these people, our nationals, are being treated badly overseas. Now, do we see such pressure now when we know that the nationals of different countries in developing countries are being treated and exploited so badly? Where is the pressure? How is this pressure conveyed so that an end to that treatment is brought in? So I would like to know myself, do we hear or do we see? We have got this, the GCM, the global agenda on migration. This is just it's an understanding, gentlemen's agreements, it is not a legal binding thing. So that means governments in sending countries have to play more important role in safeguarding their people's well-being, people who migrate to other countries. Yeah, of course, it has to be managed. And that is why there is now more focus on managing migration on both sides. And I would also throw in one thing now that you mentioned, James, it's a good question. The development assistance, which in the past, but not in the near past, which was given to Libya to manage the flow of, to stop the flow of migrants crossing from Libya into Europe, and similarly to Turkey, that is not the development assistance that is needed. What is needed in that development assistance is twofold. One, the development assistance is not going to help so much in economic growth. It hasn't for the last 70 years, we do not see, okay? But where it can be used meaningfully is in how to institute, how to help sending countries, governments, put in policies in place which would be favorable, which would safeguard the interests of migrants from these origin countries, okay? So this is where they can help them. How to put in mechanisms which would ensure the well-being of those who do migrate. Thank you.
Okay, we have from Ganesh. Ganesh, are you there? Otherwise, we'll go to Yanni Eriman. Yanni?
Yeah, hello everyone. Can you hear? If you can hear me, just
Yes, yes.
yeah. So I was just pondering on the ideas which, ma'am, you were talking about, but it is just a general question or something like I wonder to know about like your opinion. You were mentioning about these stages, and you said they are more or less phases because you were focusing more on the political thing, as you mentioned. You didn't want it to sound like an economic effect. Rather than a political one, but closer to the end, you mentioned about this political conflict, and you yourself were not sure whether that has to be a migration as such or not, if we are talking about the political conflict. So now, how can we classify in this case when we are talking about political conflicts? Then are we supposed to think that migration is only only a political like concept as such, or what about then political impact, the impact of political conflicts and other crises?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think there will be a separate lecture on the drivers of migration. In other words, why do people migrate? People migrate due to economic reasons, because of poverty, as the history tells us. The famine in Ireland drove away 1 million people in the 1850s, right? Because of poverty and lack of growth and so on. So one of the major reasons why people move is economics. In other words, they are unable to sustain themselves, poverty. Does this mean that all poor people are able to migrate? No, depends on your resources, depends on the opportunities. So while economics or the economic reasons are one of the dominant reasons that people move, others move for political reasons. If there's conflict and their life is in danger, as is the case in Syrian conflict or other conflicts for that matter, there have been civil wars in Africa, Biafra, there are civil wars in other countries in Latin America and so on. You have the case of Colombia, Central American countries where people have migrated, not because they're poor, they migrated because their life is in danger. There are attacks on their lives and they need to go into places where they can be safe. So this is the political environment. Even in the olden times, when we did the history of the migration, primitive people, they moved, went to other regions where they felt they were safe, away from wars that were happening over resources. So definitely, political conflict also. So political reasons, sociological reasons. Now, there are pressures on people because they have this gender and they don't have that gender, or they're ostracized because they are bisexual, or you understand. So on religious grounds, a lot of people left on religious grounds, even in Europe. In fact, the early migration to Canada, and I was reading while going through preparing this lecture, that in 1759 or thereabout, one Mr. Singh traveled from Punjab and he went to California to work on the plantations. Now, they were unable to categorize him whether he was white or black. He was clearly not looking black, but they categorized him as white, okay? Because he ran away from the religious persecution. The Europeans who ran away from Europe because they belonged to this thing, Jews, the political, religious persecution. So yes, political conflict does encourage people to go to safer places where they can lead their lives and show the safety of their families. Yes, definitely, political conflict is, as I said, similarly sociological, cultural reasons. And I think the lecture on the drivers of migration will speak more to that. If that satisfies you, or is that okay? Hello?
I think she got the answer.
She got it.
Yes.
Okay.
So one more from Hanichar. Hanichar, are you there? Yes, please.
Yes, hello, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Baldoui, for the presentation, very interesting one. Well, actually, I think the previous speakers mentioned already some of my inquiry about the drivers of migration and how to address, the forced migration. But as you said, Doctor, maybe we will address this problem in some future sessions, right? And then my second question was about what do you expect and what do you foresee? I mean, do you foresee any new forms of migration after this COVID crisis?
Yeah, very interesting question. As I said, in terms of permanent migration, I think there will be a halt for the time being. I don't see that. There will be halts. Other forms of migration that we are familiar with are contract, short-term. If you mean migration, physical movement, geographic movement, it will be, I think, circular migration, for a very short period of time. My own thing is, now that with this ICT, my own hunch That's my hunch. I haven't done any research on that. Because if they can now prove that it is possible to work from home, right? I see more outsourcing without physical mobility. That's my hunch. On the other hand, to develop quickly, they will also need some kind of physical labor present in the countries which have to follow this path towards development. So there might be some movement, but more on contractual, more on short-term, more on assignment-based, task-based. I think there will be more task-based. You come, tell us, like more troubleshooting. I see migration as troubleshooting. Okay, we have got this problem with that. You source people and you bring them in. You use as much ICT, as much technology as you can online, where you, even medical, we know medical records are read overseas. We know now with these robotic technologies, where you can do surgeries robotically. Okay, so there's a lot of advances. With all these advances, I see the form of migration will be, it should not be irregular. Okay, that's my fear, because there will be back doors being used somehow, and the agents are going to play a very important role in bringing in. They will have to go back to the olden times when agents were recruiting people forcibly. They will go to ports, seaports in England, and they would just, have contracts, plantation contracts, and they would just force people and say, okay, you'll get X, Y, Z, get into the ship, and then sell the contract, sell them, and so on. So I don't see much rosy, much hope, but the form of migration that might take, I hope it is not more irregular. I hope it is not that. So this is where spending countries, developing countries have to take heed of this. How to protect their population, what to create, what sort of opportunities to create, what sort of guidance that they can provide. The ministries of labor, the ministries of migration, or the ministries of diasporas, or counselors, or wherever they have outreach to the diasporas. The diaspora is going to play a very pivotal role. I see now associations of diaspora associations and so on. Other than that, it's hard. I'm sorry.
You will take one more question or two?
Sure. There's still time.
So we have Anand.
I still have my voice.
Yes, Anand Majumdar, and then we have Abu Bakr. So quickly, please ask your question. Anand Majumdar. Okay, if he's not there, then Abu Bakr.
Hi, I'm there. I'm Ananda.
Yes. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, so my question. Hi, I'm Ananda Majumdar. Thank you, ma'am. My question is, you say one of your you say in your speech that current migration is not going to be beneficial because of economic problem worldwide. Now my question is, how come we can resolve this problem? Because countries like India, China, and some other countries are overpopulated, and it's not possible to maintain, give everyone job by their government, and to maintain the population. So migration is must for the country like India and other countries for a balance. Now, how we can resolve the problem of economic, the worldwide, for the continuation of migrations?
Yeah, thank you. What a challenging question. I don't think I have any answer for that. But what I will say is, I don't see migration as a panacea for the unemployment problem. Okay, that's what this is my view. My personal view is that migration is not a panacea. Migration provides you the opportunity. Sorry, can you hear me? It provides you the opportunity to improve your life. Okay. So if people are unable to find work and governments are unable to create, I'm not saying I don't believe in governments creating jobs. I believe in governments facilitating creation of jobs. You mark the difference? In other words, the role of government is to put in place policies that would encourage people to find opportunities for themselves. Not that they are left in the lurch and say, okay, now you're in the open, a child, okay, I send you, you go and find whatever you like. No, you have clear-cut policies, both labor policies, employment policies, economic development policies, and see where there's room, what kind of jobs do we envisage to come up in the future. But we can't just have a laissez-faire policy where there's, or laissez-faire, there's no policy, okay, well, population is increasing, but somehow they'll fend for themselves because they have to survive. So I think this laxy-daxy attitude of, well, some developing countries is what, and I speak for the Caribbean as well. Same thing. What happens in the Caribbean where I am my country? People just go to America, or they could go to England because there are no opportunities at home, largely because the resources are limited, the population size is very small, and you have large diasporas. So somehow that is your pivot, that is the pulling factor, the diaspora for the Caribbean people. But is that the right way to do it? No. Does it develop your country? No. Does it bring continuity? No. So these are the hard questions that governments have to ask themselves. How do we want to develop? This is what we have. Resources, human, other resources. These are the challenges of globalization. We are part of a global society, global economy. How can we create competitive forces, both productive, labor, as well as other resources to sail above? What challenges? There are plentiful challenges. But to say we can't stop migration is the only way, no, I think I don't take that view. And that's my personal view. Because I believe that people's resources, which is their own personal resources, whether it is human or what they leave behind, those resources are not fully utilized when they leave their country. Okay, they might become rich, but are they really rich? Do they really feel rich? Rich for who? You see, when people say, I'm going abroad to make money, for who? For me, for my family, right? For my children, for my grandchildren. What does that migrant enjoy himself? That's my question. And I've done loads of interviews in the Gulf countries, loads of interviews in a number of countries in the Gulf region. And, and that is what convinced me, that people are there not because they want to be there. They don't know the psychological pain they go through when they are in these countries. It's just because they don't want to sound a failure. Last week, there was a lecture on migrants disappearing and not being found. They don't want to be found because they're not always successful in the eyes of their families. So these are some of these psychological pressures and psychological pain that people go through. So I take a different view. I mean, we can all differ, and I will not suggest migration is a panacea for solving unemployment problem. Yes, it's probably one of the ways, but it has to be done, as one of the contributors said, that it has to be done safely and regularly. It's not something you dispose of. Migrants are not a commodity to be disposed of. Okay, all right. Next.
Okay, we have a last question. After that, we'll have some comments from Professor Khadria also. Then we'll continue. So this last is by Abu Bakr. Are you there? Mr. Abu Bakr? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Based on the discussion that Ma'am has already mentioned, I want to know the difference now between immigration and migration, based on the context today, please. Thank you.
Sorry, difference between migration and? Sorry, Abu Bakr, could you repeat,
yes,
please? Yeah, what's the question?
Yes, sir. I mean, immigration and migration based on the topic today, based on the context of the topic today.
It's not audible, Abu Bakr. One second.
No.
I think he's asking, I'll just read out his question.
Okay, please. Maybe you can display.
No,
something.
actually there is. I'm not able to spot.
It's a difference between migration and, did he say emigration and immigration, or what did he say?
Can you ask directly? I'm not able to spot your question actually. Abu
Can
Bakr.
Can you rewrite?
Based on the explanation from today discussion on migration, what is the definition of migration vis-a-vis the immigration? You want to know what is difference between migration and immigration?
Oh, well, see, it's actually migration means movement of people to another locality or another geographic. Now, immigration is in movement and emigration is out. In other words, when you leave your country to go to another country, you are emigrating from your country and immigrating into another country, into another area. Okay, so emigration is outward movement, immigration is inward movement.
Thank you. With this, I think we'll also request Professor Khadria if you have any comments on this, if you are there. I think he's not there. Professor Khadria? I think he's not there. So what we'll do, we'll conclude now. Whatever questions you have, you can share with us through email, and Dr. Raj Bardoli will answer those, or we can answer them, those questions. So with this, I thank you, Dr. Raj Bardoli, for so much insightful talk, and this is very interactive, in fact. So I request all participants also to keep this momentum, keep asking questions, because that is how we learn better. So we'll have next announcement very soon through email and through your tweet.
Sorry. Dr. Sada, before you go, I
Yes.
just want to know if they have understood the questions. So if they want me to go over the questions, assignment questions, I could.
Okay. Did you get the assignment questions?
No, that's I will discuss with Dr. Raj later. I think we have already posted those questions last
No,
week.
I wanted to ask if anyone has any clarification on the questions before I go.
Sohel
Huh?
Rana want to ask some question. If you can allow him, Sohel Rana, he has already raised his hand.
So what we'll do this should be the last question. We are just crossing 7:20. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Is that clear?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I just wanted to know that in past migration history, we knew some of the routes, especially like Silk Route, Ocean Route. So, is there any specific way of routes that is very important for the migration evaluation? And the second question is, after this COVID pandemic, are you I mean, is your intuition is about any regional migration, like within the Asian country or within the Europe? Like we are hearing some of the things that some of the left behind European country, they are focusing on the the developed European countries. So for Asian countries like us, like India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So what about your assumption? Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, good question. Now, as regards the routes, in those days, in the olden time, just a second. Okay, in the olden time, the migration, the routes were, I mean, they were ships, steamships, and they were operated by, just a second. Yeah, so they were not doing voluntary, but for the Europeans who traveled, it depended on the ships that they could get going to America. So they were going to America, initially to the US, and then later on to Canada, and then South America and so on. So those were, it's not that they picked a plane and decided which route they're going to take. There were no planes, okay? Now, as regards inter-regional migration or migration within developing countries, I think this is a very important question, and quite, I think this should jog our brains a bit, as that migration is not always running to a developed country. And if you recall, when I also talked about 50 million migrants from China and India, they went to Asian countries, right? Asian countries, especially Chinese. They went to Thailand, they went to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to the Philippines, to Singapore, and so on. So there were, even then in the 20s and 30s and 40s, some movement towards more developed Asian countries, Burma, for example, for that matter. So there would continue to be some movements, of course, towards those as they develop, as is the case in South Africa. Most among the African countries that are more developed is South Africa. So there was, soon after the end of apartheid, people from neighboring African countries, they moved to South Africa to work. But okay, it was whatever form of migration it was. It was both regular, permanent, as well as irregular, okay? So there have been cases. Now, as regards movement from India or from Bangladesh into other Asian countries, yes, there's definitely a good prospects there, especially Malaysia. Now, Singapore is a very small country. It's unlikely to get a whole lot of people except through maybe occasional. Malaysia has its own, they have their own immigration policies. You know, there was a time in the 40s that Malaysia was ready to subsidize the repatriation of migrants out of Malaysia because they didn't want them anymore. So they said, okay, that's their old policy. We'll pay your passage and you go home. So that's one case. But you know, the other development, which is interesting, is inter-regional through sub-regional groupings. Sub-regional groupings, I can speak for the Caribbean and African countries. You have these sub-regional groupings where certain countries fall into, like ECOWAS that Paddy mentioned in one of her lectures or presentations. So you have SADC, you have ECOWAS, you have ECOWAS, SADC, ECC, East African Countries Associations, North Algeria, and so on. Maghreb countries. So there are now sub-regional groupings where countries belonging to the sub-region have free mobility initially as tourists. In other words, you can move freely without obtaining. We'll be introducing free labor mobility depending on how much they're developed. Okay, so it will depend on movement within Asian countries or other developing countries will depend on how developed, how quickly some countries develop to be able to attract. But on the other hand, migrants also help countries to develop. Okay, so I think there's a good chance. The other chance in the Caribbean, we have free mobility among all the Anglophone English-speaking countries, 14 English-speaking countries, travel without visa. And at the same time, we recently introduced skills certificate, which means if you have skills which are recognized from one country to the other country, then the Labor Department certifies that this is a compatible certificate. They have to go through your university certificates or your technical certificates. And once you have the skills certificate, that is a free movement. You can go anywhere within that region to get a job, which is a way of regular migration. Yes, I agree with you. I think we will be seeing that because there are lots of obstacles, lots of bottlenecks to going to OECD countries, and they will only increase. They're not going to decrease. They will look at the Trump administration. Yeah. So there are building walls. So countries will be building walls to deter migrants from coming in, but through irregular means. But regular will be small. So I agree with you. Yes, we should be looking towards that and preparing more cooperative technical cooperation among the Asian countries, among the Pacific countries, among Caribbean, or between. So I think there should be more focus on that side. So I think that is very good. That's quite a provocative question which should make us think about it. And thank you very much for ending this note.
Thank you, Dr. Raj Bardoli. And there are lots of appreciation for you from students. And I think they enjoyed your talk. And I convey their gratitude to you. And it was really exciting. You know, all of you participated so well, asking questions, making it very interactive. Thank you all. And thank you, Dr. Raj Bardoli, for so much insightful talk. Keep
okay,
going.
I've lost my voice. But thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope I was useful. I'm sorry, I've lost my voice now. But
So
thank you so much.
Conclude. In fact, it is already time, so we'll conclude now. Comrade James, we'll keep your question. You can ask directly through email. So I shared it, Dr. Raj Bardoli email. You can ask if there is anything. So thank you once again, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye.
All right, bye-bye. Until next time, maybe tomorrow.